Welcome to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's virtual learning studio in Chicago, Illinois. I am Kathleen McDonald, Senior Director of Strategy Programs and Education. Founded in 2003, the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's mission is to increase the public's understanding of military history, military affairs, and national security by providing a forum for the study and exploration of our military, past, present, and future, with a specific focus on their stories, sacrifices, and values. With a national and global reach, these spaces and events aim to share the stories of those who served, helping citizens everywhere appreciate the relationship between the armed forces and the civilians whose freedoms they protect. The virtual learning studio offers monthly webinars designed for teachers to use in the classroom, grades 6 through 12 and any age beyond, with guest speakers from across the country. Be sure to sign up for our emails and go to our website for more information on upcoming programs. These webinars are recorded and available to the public to watch again on the PMML YouTube playlist about 1 week after the live Zoom presentation. Today's guest speaker is Al Wheat. With 6.5 years of classroom experience teaching history, special education, digital media, and introductory computer courses, Wheat is currently the Director of Education for the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. In his role, he creates and manages resources to benefit teachers covering Mississippi topics using primary sources provided by MDAH. He also serves as the coordinator for the Mississippi History Day, the state's affiliate of the National History Day program. Today, Al will take us into the battles of World War II and show us how African-American military service in World War II helped to ignite the modern-day civil rights movement with the WWII campaign to defeat fascism and the enemy abroad while concurrently fighting for freedom and democracy at home. On behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Al Wheat. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. I've got a PowerPoint that I've put together to help with some visuals, so you're not just looking at my talking head the entire time. And we're going to look at World War II and the Civil Rights Movement and how World War II really impacted what happened throughout the country in the Civil Rights Movement. And once we start getting into some of the civil rights aspects of this, there will be a little bit of a Mississippi-centric bent to some of the slides and some of the information, but they always have a national impact as well. So I make sure to give it a tie to that national stories that everyone can feel free to use this information and its impact beyond just the bounds of Mississippi. So to start, let's look at some misconceptions, or a big misconception that the Civil Rights Movement really began with either Brown versus Board of Education or with the lynching of Emmett Till. And while these two were integral moments in the Civil Rights Movement, especially with Till being what truly sparked the modern civil rights movement, they weren't where the seeds were planted. This isn't where the fight truly began. Honestly, we could go back to post-Civil War and even pre-Civil War for where the true battle for civil rights, especially for African Americans, started in our country. But when we're talking about the modern civil rights movement, really it starts with World War II and that WWII campaign. So the WWII campaign really was an attempt to create equality both abroad and at home, to try to fight for the freedoms of those in Europe that they were fighting for, while also trying to be treated as equals back home in America as well. And this started really in the defense industry area, where, well, first let's look at this quote from activist CLR James, who kind of explains what African Americans were facing at as the war was getting ready to start. Why should I shed my blood for Roosevelt's America, for Cotton Ed Smith and Senator Bilbo, for the whole Jim Crow, Negro-hating South, for the low-paid, dirty jobs of which Negroes have to fight for the few dollars of relief in the insults, discrimination, police brutality, and perpetual poverty to which Negroes are condemned even in the more liberal North. So very poignant, because it points out that this is not just a Southern issue. that it is in the North as well. While not necessarily as violent always in the North, it was still a Northern issue as well. And this quote in particular I picked because Senator Theodore Bilbo was not just from Mississippi and a notorious virulent racist from Mississippi who was a state senator or U.S. senator from Mississippi, but is also from my hometown of Poplarville, Mississippi. So I know Mr. Bilbo quite well and his story. So that made sure I picked that quote for that particular reason. So the WWII campaign starts really in the defense industry where they're trying to break down these walls where literally Black men are being drafted to go and fight in Europe, but Black men and women can't even work to produce the supplies to supply their family members, their neighbors, their colleagues with the materials they need to fight the war. And one of the biggest proponents of this is A. Philip Randolph, who penned this letter here from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to kind of, lay that out, how they felt that there was a need for desegregation within the defense industry. And they eventually achieved that. At least in theory and in law, they achieved that when Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 8802, which desegregates the defense industries, which you can see here. So a step in the right direction, but not all encompassing, obviously, because despite the fact that the defense industry was now starting to become desegregated, the military is still segregated at this point as well. And then obviously African-American people throughout the country are still being discriminated against in other industries in the ability to vote, use public services, public transportation, et cetera. So that's what we're going to look a little bit into next, is some of the ways that this happened in World War II. And one of the things I wanted to point out, I actually went to the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum at Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, Mississippi last week, and took some pictures that not only fit a assignment I'm doing for my grad school class tonight, but just so happened to work for this presentation as well. So just a little bit of double dipping to make life easier. But I learned about some stuff that I haven't even learned about. And this is as a lifelong Mississippian who studies Mississippi history and specifically civil rights history. It was interesting to see this, specifically this exhibit on the WWII 11, a relatively unknown group of the 333rd Artillery Battalion, which was an all-Black artillery battalion that were heavily attacked, damaged, killed during the Battle of the Bulge. But it's a little bit overlooked because it happened 1 month after the Malady Massacre, which was a much larger massacre in terms of number of people killed. So it gets a little bit overshadowed in that regard. But basically the story of this is as the 333rd is being enveloped by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge, 11 members are able to escape capture and get to the village of WWII, where they seek refuge with a family there that has a house in this small village in the Ardennes. And eventually one of the neighbors see the Black men entering this home to seek refuge and rat them out to the Germans. So the Germans arrive not long after, demand the 11 come out, take them to a nearby cow pasture, have them run across the field, and they're gunned down. And then for some reason, and this I could not find information on why, for some reason, when the Army investigated this massacre, they demanded and succeeded in having the story filed as a top secret file and not released for, I don't remember exactly how long, but still to that front, that it just kind of got buried. So not only is it overshadowed because of the Malady Massacre, but also because it was intentionally buried by the Army for whatever reason they chose to do so. 3 Mississippians were of the 11 that were murdered here, which is why the Armed Forces Museum had this exhibit set up. You can also see there are members from South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and West Virginia, and Arkansas as well. So interesting story that most people haven't heard, and I wanted to provide that. So as we can see, the treatment is not great. African Americans are thought to not be good soldiers until they actually start fighting in World War II and start gaining more respect. But this lack of equal treatment, both at home and in the military, was preyed upon by the Axis powers, and particularly Germany, who released some rather poignant propaganda to help try to get African-American soldiers to give up on the cause or to defect or what have you, despite the fact that the Nazis were fairly anti anybody with African heritage as well. Like, they were very racist. They pulled a lot of their racist ideals from the racist things that America had done. So they were, not calling the kettle black, but they were capitalizing on that to try to demonize America in the eyes of their own soldiers, especially of African-American descent. You can see one here where they have this evil robot that is attacking Germany that kind of points out some of the different ills they see of America. So you can see, a noose hanging off one of the arms here. You can see two Black people that are caged and having to dance for entertainment. You can see all these different aspects of American culture that they're trying to demonize and point out. And this is more of a propaganda for German citizens, as well as anybody else that might pick that up. But then they started dropping very targeted pamphlets where they knew Black regiments or soldiers were during World War II. Ones that really preyed on the fact that they are not treated as equals and that they have families back home that they should not die and leave alone. So they talk about how great it would be to be a POW of the Germans here. So no need to go on a diet, plenty of food, nourishing, well-cooked, and wholesome for all POWs. Don't believe the nonsense about German prejudice against the colored man. He gets a square deal like any other soldier in German hands, which we know is nonsense, but that is still what they were trying to spread. And here we can see another one. Tiny tots want daddy back. You can see they are pulling out all the stops to try to tug on the heartstrings of these soldiers. They want you to come back alive. You only have one chance. After the war, they will be sent home to their folks as soon as possible. So, just trying to spread this message that they're going to be treated well in German hands if they surrender and turn themselves over, and they'll be returned to their families safe and sound. And then another here, don't hesitate. If you wait too long, it may be too late. Come over to us if you are fed up with this war and want to get home safe and sound. So the same kind of messaging over and over again, but they're dropping these pamphlets or providing them for Black soldiers or where they know Black soldiers are to be, so that they can try to, dismantle the forces that America had put together. And America tried to play off the fact that they were united, that it was better in America than it was in Germany by propaganda such as this, the United We Win campaign, which, in theory, what you're seeing by Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, which established the Fair Employment Practices Commission. You can see they're trying to play off of that, even though, this happy scene of a white man and a Black man working together would have been rare. Not saying it didn't exist, but not the standard by any means at this time. We're trying to play off of those same ideals to try to emblazon Black people home to really Black people at home to work for the American military cause. So during World War II, Camp Vandoren is a perfect example of really what the Germans were trying to say in their propaganda coming true. So Camp Vandoren was a army training ground in southwest Mississippi, right on the border of Mississippi and Louisiana. And as you can see, this historical marker mentions the 99th and 63rd divisions that trained there. No mention of the 364th Infantry Regiment, or excuse me, the 500. The 364th Infantry Regiment, I will get this right eventually, were sent there. And this is the first time that the people that were at Camp Vandoren had ever seen not just Black soldiers, but also Black officers. And nonetheless, an all-Black battalion had artillery. So this is a jaw-dropping experience for the people at Camp Vandoren. And it comes to a head one day when there was you can see some images of Camp Vandoren, obviously still segregated because you see a lot of white officers and white soldiers here. But they held a desegregated USO show, which caused a lot of tension. And a lot of the soldiers and officers were not pleased. And then shortly thereafter, the Black soldiers infiltrated the whites only PX, which a PX, if you don't know, is the post exchange. That's where you would go to buy supplies. You can buy food, that kind of thing. They invaded it. It was supposed to be whites only, and it caused obviously some violence to the point where the 364th Infantry Regiment was removed from Camp Vandoren. But again, what Germany is showing the soldiers are spreading to the African-American soldiers in Germany or in Europe is true. A lot of what they're saying is true, sans, the fact that they would be treated well in Germany. So then, obviously, there's a big call post-World War II for Truman to desegregate the military. Here you can see a letter from some white residents that were begging Truman to desegregate the military, really spread the fact that if they're fighting for democracy across the world, then they should have the right to democracy at home, which eventually, of course, leads to Truman issuing Executive Order 9981, which desegregates the military. And you can see a newspaper article stating as such. And then you see this note from the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum as well. Despite Executive Order 9981, there was considerable resistance from senior military leaders. President Dwight Eisenhower continued Truman's policy and presided over the completion of desegregation in the armed forces, but the Army's last segregated units were finally disbanded in 1955. So it still wasn't until 1955 that the Army became desegregated. Much what you see after Brown versus Board, that it takes an extensive amount of time to truly enact Brown versus Board, where I think like in Mississippi, the last school to get desegregated was in like 1976, 75. So, 20 years after Brown versus Board. So similar situation. But this is still preyed upon as we get into the Cold War. So you can see here, this is a piece of Soviet propaganda that is talking about the ills of America. And in the top right, you can see depictions of the Klan when lynching a Black person. So even though we have taken steps in the right direction to start desegregating the military, at least, and defense industries, it's still being preyed upon as a propaganda opportunity for our opposition at this time and our enemies. So with that, I'm going to stop there for our 15 minutes break, and then we'll get into the civil rights movement a little heavier.
Great. Thank you so much, Al. Our first question is, you've mentioned how the Germans were putting out all this propaganda suggesting that they would be treated well in POW camps. Do you have any information on exactly how African Americans are treated in their POW camps? Because we know they certainly didn't live up to what they were showing in the propaganda films for the Jewish population.
So that's the biggest thing, is they were very negatively treated just in general in Germany, even outside of POW camps. There was no equality there for African Americans or for Black people in general, for anyone from African descent, even if they weren't African Americans, because Hitler really took, I saw an article, I didn't get to read all of it in prepping for this, where it was basically on how Hitler took America's steps to racism and segregation and let that influence a lot of his beliefs in what he did. Specific instances of Black soldiers that were taken as POW, I don't have off the top of my head, but I guarantee you there is some great research to be done on that. I'm sure there are some great stories about it. And if any of your kids are doing History Day, could be a stellar project.
Great. Can you also tell us a little bit more about any kind of repercussions as they were going through the process of desegregating the military, repercussions for those units that were not following the Executive Order 9981?
So I think it really would depend on what stage it is and how openly and brazenly they were taking part in this. Obviously, just because a unit is desegregated doesn't mean that the racism and subjugation stops there. There are still very casual ways that those soldiers can still be treated less than their white counterparts. And we see a lot of that, how that happens in the civil rights movement, where even if you are able to, once the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, African Americans are allowed to vote in theory, But the reality is all these steps and places are put into place. So it's a lot of different things, such as inability to rise up the ranks of their positions, inability to move forward in the military, et cetera, where some of those repercussions came from.
Great, thank you so much. Can you also tell us a little bit more, both of the desegregation efforts for the workplace as well as the military itself were coming through executive orders. And do you think there was any chance that we would have seen desegregation through other means? Would Congress have ever been able to come together and pass anything of that nature? Would the military have been able to do this independently? Because we know there's, African-American service prior to World War II?
So I think what you see a lot with, at least in the military, is I think that last panel from the Armed Forces Museum explains that well. There was still massive resistance to desegregation even after the executive order is released. So I think if you were reliant on the military to do that themselves, it would not have ended well. You may have had some leaders, especially after their experiences in World War II. There were a lot of all-black battalions that still had white leadership in the military. And it changed a lot of the ways those white leaders felt. The Wereth 11 in particular, I forget the name of their lieutenant colonel that was over them, but he totally shifted his worldview by fighting alongside those men and seeing what they were capable of. As far as relying on Congress, that would have been nigh impossible to get through at this point in time. You see even how reluctant at times that LBJ is, even though he ends up passing a lot of this landmark legislation in the mid-60s. He was still very reluctant to go too far because he did not want to lose the Southern vote. And that thought and that stranglehold that the Southern senators had and Southern House of Representative members had was even stronger in the 50s. And the 40s. You still had a very strong presence from people like Theodore Bilbo that would have had enough influential power to stop that from occurring at the Senate or House level.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We've covered all the questions thus far.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Al.
Okay, no problem. So this is where we hit more of my bread and butter, which is the civil rights movement and how World War II impacted it directly. And a great case study for that are these two men here. This on the left that you see is Medgar Evers. He was the first NAACP field secretary in the state of Mississippi. And on the right is his brother, Charles Evers. Medgar served with the Red Ball Express and saw combat in both Belgium and France, while Charles was a combat engineer in the Pacific Theater. So both very involved during World War II, but once they came back to Mississippi, they still could not vote and participate in the political process, which, if you can't vote, then you can't vote for people that have your best interests in heart, and then you can't get things passed that make your life more equal to your white counterparts. So the inability to vote just robs you of the ability to make life better for yourself, for your people. So what they did is they decided to, on July 2nd, 1946, they led a group of Black War II veterans through the streets of Decatur, Mississippi, fairly small town in Mississippi, with the hope to go to the courthouse and register to vote. And just to explain how few Black people were able to vote in the state of Mississippi, immediately post-Civil War, I think 90-ish% of the Black population in Mississippi were registered to vote. Post-Reconstruction, once the quote-unquote Mississippi Plan was enacted, that dwindled to less than 6%. So there's a reason it's called the Mississippi Plan. There's a reason other states adopted the Mississippi Plan, is because of how effective it was at disenfranchising Black people in the state. So we're still floating around those numbers in 1946, 6-ish% of Black people in the state are registered to vote. So, of course, once they get to the courthouse to register, they're met by a white mob where the Evers brothers remark that some 15 or 20 armed white men surged in behind us, men I had grown up with and had played with. So you're talking about people that you had grown up with, had been friends with, had literally played with on the playground, that were now denying you the right to vote with arms. Preventing you from getting in there to register to vote. So you can really see, regardless of the great work they did in World War II, how little that mattered once they got back to America. So there's obvious opposition to the civil rights movement. We're just going to go through some of the ways that different states opposed the civil rights movement early on in the 40s and 50s. So one infamously is the literacy test. I really like using this. I believe this is from Louisiana's literacy test. And I just want to point out some of the aspects here that are really show how difficult it was to pass this, to try to register to vote, and how subjective it could be. They intentionally made the directions confusing. So if you look at number 10, for example, it says in the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. So they are intentionally making the directions more obtuse so that it would be more difficult to pass. Or number 11, cross out the number necessary when making the number below 1 million. Well, let's say you cross out one of the first zeros. They may tell you, oh, that you were supposed to cross out the last zero. Or maybe you crossed out the last zero and they're like, oh, that wasn't the right one to cross out. So this was very subjective. Number 12, this one really confuses me. Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle 4. So if the line starts at circle 2, how does it also go below circle 2 is my question. So you can see just how obtuse they were making this. In Mississippi, a famous one was you would have to go up and correctly guess or estimate the number of beans that were in a jar. And they could just tell you that you were wrong. Like there was no taking the beans out and then counting them in front of you. They just asked you. And if you got it wrong in their eyes, you could not register to vote. Other ways that were done was a poll tax that usually couldn't have been afforded by those who were trying to register through these means. And then some states enacted a grandfather clause, which this is their way around poor, illiterate white people not being able to vote. Because if the rule was if you couldn't pass the literacy test and couldn't pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. The grandfather clause stated unless your grandparents owned land in the state. Well, for most Black people in the 40s, their grandparents couldn't have owned land in the state because chances are they were either enslaved or they were sharecroppers post-enslavement. So that really is where this stems from, where the grandfather clause was added in to make sure that poor whites were not also disenfranchised in this case. And what this led to was a number of organizations that were created to make sure that this segregation, disenfranchisement, racism in general was being upheld throughout the South. And one of the most infamous is the Citizens Council, often remarked as the White Citizens Council, although I've had a scholar here in Jackson, Dr. Stephanie Rolfe, who works at Millsaps College, tell me you wouldn't have had to say White Citizens Council because it was laughable that anybody that wasn't white would have been in it. So you can just call it a Citizens Council. It was formed, the first one was formed in Indianola, Mississippi, with the goal to create and provide a more organized resistance to the civil rights movement. They typically tried to do so through nonviolent means. So they referred to themselves as the quote unquote Uptown Klan, was often how they called themselves. They also pounced on communist fears, a growing opposition to the growing federal government, and really tried to conceal racist ideology in conservative values. So what they might outright say might not be racist, but they try to say it through conservative values of wanting to keep things how they've always been, et cetera, just to not out and out say directly racist things. So they produced questions and ads like this. Ask yourself this important question: what have I done to personally maintain segregation? And this is from Dallas County in Selma, Alabama. You can see up here the Selma Times Journal. And this is 1963 that this paper was produced. They also produced a lot of political cartoons. As you can see here, the box down here says "to the South from the Supreme Court." You see snakes coming out of it. And the snake is representative of integration, choking out the Southern schools, as you can see over to the right. So very clear what their motives are here. They also produce a lot of films. This is from the Citizens Council Forum collection of films and television programs. Eventually, they develop a Citizens Council of America. And this takes different looks in different states, such as Georgia's States' Rights Councils, North Carolina Patriots, the Tennessee Federation for Constitutional Government. That's a real nice way to make a racist organization sound really pretty and upstanding. The Tennessee Federation for Constitutional Government. And then the Virginia Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberties, which again, a lot of pretty language to cover up. It was a really racist organization. So they produced these different newspapers, radio, and television programs, but their most lasting legacy in a lot of states is the idea of a council school, which was an all-white private school that was set up to avoid desegregation in public schools. You see a large push for this. You can see this is fairly late, 68, 69. But you can see a lot of these schools starting to pop up in southern states right after Brown versus Board of Education, just trying to avoid the desegregation issue altogether by having these white segregated academies. It's always been interesting to me when talking to some of my friends that live in the Northeast or what have you. And it's like private schools in those areas don't have the same negative connotation that they do down here. It's in a lot of places, private schools are an elite thing, where in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, a lot of these private schools were established. You can look, schools established typically post 1955, 1956, and a lot established in the late 60s, early 70s when Brown versus Board was finally being enforced in a lot of those states. And a lot of those schools still exist and are still predominantly white, if not all white. And then Mississippi took it one step further by creating what is called the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. It's a real official sound for basically what was a secret police in the state of Mississippi. It was formed in Mississippi on March 29th, 1956, in direct response to Brown versus Board of Education. With the goal to do and perform any and all acts and things deemed necessary and proper to protect the sovereignty of the state of Mississippi from the encroachment by the federal government or any branch, department, or agency thereof. So really they have three eras that under three different governors of what the organization looked like. So this is under James P. Coleman. The commission had kind of a muted approach. Think of them kind of like the FBI at this point. So they're just doing a lot of research and keeping an eye on what the quote unquote enemy proposes to do. But they are keeping very close tabs on anybody even remotely possibly connected to the civil rights movement or civil rights activity in Mississippi and in surrounding states. They have plenty of files on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the like as well. And then the next step, they take another direction, another step to being a little more brazen under Governor Ross Barnett. It became much more aggressive under Barnett. He actually creates a speakers bureau program to go out to the north and west and talk about how great race relations are in Mississippi, which is a joke in the early 60s and late 50s, but really had a subversive hunt to define key civil rights leaders in the state. And if you go to the Sovereignty Commission files, which are on our website, at the MDH website, in our digital collection, so completely accessible, it's over 20 or 30,000 files and images related to the tabs they kept on civil rights activists. And you can search by activist name, et cetera. But when you do something like, I searched for the name Rita Schwerner. So Rita Schwerner was the wife of Michael Schwerner, who was one of the three civil rights activists, along with Andrew Goodman and James Chaney, that were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi during Freedom Summer. We're going to get to Freedom Summer in a second. But they kept tabs on her to the point of knowing when and what store she went to buy a Singer sewing machine. So this is not just taking tabs on civil rights meetings, on organizations, on meetings to organize activities. This is something as innocuous as buying a sewing machine. And they're keeping tabs on where she went, where she bought it from, and what brand of sewing machine it was. So it just kind of gives you the level of invasiveness that they had in the state. And then lastly, once Governor Barnett is through with his term under Governor Paul B. Johnson, the commission started investigating more radical groups like the Klan so that they could try to distance themselves from violent organizations. So they tried to make themselves appear to be more all-encompassing, but not long after Paul B. Johnson took over, the Sovereignty Commission kind of ceased to exist and ceased to receive state funding, which pretty much killed the organization. You can find those on the MDAH website. Here's what the search looks like for that. So you can search by last name, you can search by first name, and see kind of the files and information they kept on a number of these civil rights activists. There's also an extensive image collection. So what you see here are a lot of the mugshots from freedom riders in Mississippi. So freedom riders were people who tried to desegregate interstate bus travel So a lot of times they would get on a bus in Virginia or North Carolina, Tennessee, and then try to ride through the South. Because if the bus was interstate travel, at that point, it was a federal concern, not a state concern. So the federal government could weigh in and make policy to prevent those buses from being segregated, from being discriminated, et cetera. Often ended violently. So you had instances in Alabama where buses were firebombed. In Mississippi, as soon as they crossed the border into Mississippi, they were stopped. They were on their way to, I believe this particular bus was on its way to Baton Rouge or New Orleans. And we're told that if they came willingly and were willing to be arrested, non-violently, that nothing bad would happen to them once they left the border. But if they didn't come willingly, there would be no protection for them from the state. So those freedom riders, many of them ended up being in prison, some of which ended up in Parchman prison, which is notorious for how terrible it treated its inmates. And, until very recently was still notorious for how terrible it treated its inmates, even as soon as, 2015, 2016 and forward. But Parchman Farm, which is in the Mississippi Delta, where many of them ended up being arrested and sent to. So then we get to 1964, which this happens the year after Medgar Evers, who we talked about, World War II veteran, Red Ball Express. He gets assassinated in 1963, coming home from work. He typically parked his car so that he could exit directly from his door of his car straight into the house, so that there was little chance of him being accosted. But this particular day, I don't know if he forgot or was tired and it lapsed, but he went around to the back of his car to get something out of the back seat and was shot. So then in 1964, people from across the country come to Mississippi to work towards desegregation and getting the right to vote in the state. So they held training grounds in 1963 in Ohio and in some college campuses in other states to come to Mississippi to work towards registering to vote. This is where Stokely Carmichael gets one of his big starts in the civil rights movement, working in Mississippi during the civil rights movement. Bob Moses, who is not a native Mississippian, comes to Mississippi and is a massive organizer in the Mississippi Delta as well as Southwest Mississippi. And they do a lot of different things in the state. So this is really the brainchild of the Council of Federated Organizations, which you can see some information here on this Mississippi historical marker. They actually have the COFO headquarters has been maintained by Jackson State University. You can still visit it to this day if you're on campus and get a great tour of it from Dr. Robbie Luckett, who is on staff there. But you can see COFO was a conglomeration of CORE, the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and some local groups to really put Freedom Summer in motion. And they did things like opened freedom schools. So this is so Black people in the state could get supplemental education so that they could be more readily educated and be on more par educationally with their white counterparts in the state. Or if they had been expelled for trying to desegregate a school, for example, or been expelled for doing a walkout of a school, they could have attended a freedom school to get additional education. It also taught them specific strategies to register to vote. So how to beat the literacy test, how to get around some of the tricks they use to keep Black people from registering to vote were taught here so that they could do that, as well as, and they taught this abroad as well, or I say abroad, throughout the country when they were doing these training sessions on how to enact nonviolent resistance. So that way you're not fighting back and not getting harmed even worse or killed because you're being violent in response to the treatment you're receiving. And then finally, the big thing that Freedom Summer does is it launches the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, where the all-Black delegation, not all-Black delegation, but mostly Black delegation with the MFDP went to New Jersey to the Democratic National Convention to challenge the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party. They ended up not being able to be seated. The National Democrats feared that siding with them would lose the Southern vote. So again, that goes back to your question, Kathleen, of if something like this could have happened in Congress. The National Democrats were very scared they would lose the Southern vote if they allowed the MFDP to be seated instead of the all-white delegation. So even as late as 1964, that's still a concern. So the MFDP was offered a compromise, and it was one they were not pleased with and turned down. But they were offered that two members right here of the party. This is Aaron Henry, is the black man on the right, and Reverend Ed King, the white chaplain of Tougaloo College, is on the left. And they would be at-large delegates seated. So they would get 2 seats of the Mississippi Party. And they ended up refusing that and walked out. But what happened is during the Senate hearings to try to, or the hearings, not Senate hearings, but the hearings to see if they would be seated, was when this lady came to national prominence. This is Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou Hamer proceeds to give an impassioned speech during this hearing. This is where she gave what is called the I Question America speech, which if you've never heard, as soon as this webinar is over, please go look it up and listen to it. It's so impactful, where she uttered her famous quote, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," which stems from Miss Fannie Lou Hamer here. Because she's that tired of her treatment in Mississippi. She's been sent to Parchman Prison. She's been beaten at Parchman Prison. She has experienced the life of a formerly enslaved person. She's experienced the life of a sharecropper, and is now a civil rights activist in the state and has faced all the repercussions that come with that. So this is happening around noon, 1 o'clock during the day. Well, LBJ was legitimately afraid for the mass of America to hear Fannie Lou Hamer give her speech. So what he did is he called a press conference for the exact same time so that national news networks would have to cut away to his press conference instead of giving Fannie Lou Hamer airtime. But what happened is it backfired because the news agencies then ran her testimony in prime time around 5 or 6 p.m. in the evening. So his attempts to get eyes off of Fannie Lou Hamer actually, in fact, drew more eyes to it because she ended up getting a primetime slot for that I Question America speech. And what this does is it actually starts to influence other movements throughout the country as well. It helps spawn other movements who take concepts and ideas from either they were involved in the civil rights movement and took those ideas or saw what happened and the successes that eventually occur, such as the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it empowers other people such as Bayard Rustin here. Bayard Rustin was heavily involved in the civil rights movement, more usually behind the scenes, helping to organize and starting to become an outspoken gay rights activist in the 1970s. And then, of course, it also heavily influences the American Indian movement, AIM, as it is often called, was influenced by the protests and activism that occurred in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. So all of this stems from what happens in World War II. So because of the inequalities that Black people faced in both at home and during the war, and their attempts to combat that with the Double Victory campaign into the civil rights movement, then influences even more people to seek out equality and equal treatment in the country. So that just kind of shows the far-reaching impact that World War II had. Not just on the Black community in America, but the gay community, the American Indian community, and the like, the Native community. And yeah, so that's without much fanfare, that is the end of my presentation, and happy to have any questions.
Great, Al. Thank you so much. This was a really interesting walk through the material. I'd like to go back to the voting rights. I thought showing the actual literacy test was so powerful to actually see how easy it would be to trip up on those questions, no matter who you are, and how subjective they could be in deciding whether you passed or not. And sort of just making comparison, because today we talk still about there being issues with people's voting rights. So you gave us some really concrete examples from the past. Are those techniques the same techniques that are being used today? Are you familiar with?
I don't think it's exactly the same from what I'm familiar with, but there are obviously ways that people are trying to discourage voting. I think that's the best way to maybe phrase it. It's strongly discouraged, maybe not outright outlawed, which was the attempts here. I think it's less blatant. I think it's less, although it's becoming more obvious, I still think it's a little less blatant than requiring, somebody to pass a very subjective literacy test, for example. Mississippi, it would have people try to interpret parts of the Constitution, the state Constitution, which if you're illiterate, it's not going to happen. And because most African Americans weren't illiterate in Mississippi at the time because they weren't allowed to go to school because they're desegregated. And if they did go to school, it was underfunded and under-resourced, et cetera. It was just this a complete system to be complicit in keeping Black people from voting in the state.
So were they, back in the past, were they using any techniques like not having the polling stations near communities of color?
Oh, absolutely. I imagine in many cases there wouldn't have even been one there at all because they would have thought, what's the point? And I say the white government would have thought, what's the point?
Right.
So I think you'd have a lot of that going on. They also, if I'm not mistaken, I think I remember that they were very restrictive on what hours they would have registration open for you to come register to vote, and it would change constantly to try to cause confusion and discouragement.
So unfortunately, we learn a few things from history. Can you tell us a little bit more about the experience of the servicemen, the African-American servicemen, once they came back to the U.S.?
So a lot of it was a return to quote unquote normal, to what life was before they ever left the country to go back. So, I mean, in the case of, say, Medgar and Charles, they came back to Mississippi to exactly how life existed before they left. It was still desegregated, or it was still segregated. They still couldn't vote. There were still segregated places to eat, transportation, et cetera. So it was very much disheartening for many, and this is why it spurred them to get involved with the movement, because they went over there and fought for other people's freedoms that they did not have themselves once they got back, because nothing changed. I mean, the only thing that changed was the defense industry with the creation of the FEDC, and even FEPC, and even that dissipates once the war's over because there's no longer a defense industry, or at least not as full scale as it was during the war. So lack of opportunities to provide for your family, lack of opportunities to better yourself, lack of opportunities to get an education. Still plenty of examples in Mississippi of people that try to desegregate schools, challenge that. I mean, obviously James Meredith is very well known throughout the country for his attempts to integrate the University of Mississippi and the violence and riots that caused. Although he was ultimately successful, there was still a lot of violence that happened because of it. I mean, JFK had to send in the National Guard to escort him to class. So that's really what they were facing when they came back home. And obviously it's heightened in the South with a little bit more subtle racism and subjugation in the North. So
you brought up again the Executive Order 8820 about FDR's fair employment practices.
Yes.
And how quickly was that suddenly shifted to allow the firing of all those folks and not rehiring in the factories?
That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know when that dissipated post World War II. I don't know when they really started to tail off with that. I don't know if they kept up some of it due to the Cold War being so heightened that it still provided some opportunities. And then obviously once we're in the Cold War, Korea and Vietnam are not far behind. So I imagine some aspects of it still existed at that point. But I would imagine they were able to scale back quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question. Mm-hmm. With all the, just a little bit of a comparison, you brought up a lot of the paperwork and the photos that are in the archives now that record the very brazen tactics of gathering information and investigating and terrorizing African Americans. And it links very directly to all the paperwork that the Germans had on all of the Jews. Has that come back to bite some of these organizations, and really has that come to the surface to show solid evidence of, the terror that was done?
In some instances, some of the information provided has helped, especially in cases of violence against African Americans, or even lynchings, murders. Some of the information that was in the Sovereignty Commission files helped, especially once they were released to the public. Have helped connect some dots with people who were implicated in different incidents, such as the murder of different civil rights activists and the like. But for the most part, most of the people implicated in being involved with the Sovereignty Commission pretty much got away scot-free, as sad as that is to say. And that really by the time it was unsealed so you could see who was involved, a lot of those people had already passed. So it was a case where they weren't able to bring anybody to justice because they had already died by that point. And I spoke with an investigative journalist in Mississippi not long ago about a man who was lynched in 1959, who my thesis topic is on. And the investigative journalist decided not to reopen that case because everybody implicated was dead. So there was no opportunity to bring someone to justice. So they wanted to put their money and their attention on cases that could be reopened and someone could be brought to justice.
But it sounds like a treasure trove for any budding historians out there to
absolutely
and continue to correct the record.
Absolutely is. I used it extensively in my thesis research. I know students in Mississippi have used it extensively when doing research for their History Day projects or even just class projects. It is the single most visited website on MDAH's webpage. It is the most clicked on and most searched. And just to give an example of how extensive they are, I'm going to pull up Medgar Evers's mentions just because we feature him so heavily. And we really talk so heavily about Medgar is because he really is kind of an unsung hero of the civil rights movement. He's not well known, and he should be, because in Mississippi, he was kind of the person who was organizing and orchestrating things in the state up until his assassination in '63. So I'm going to share screen just real quick to show some numbers. So here you can see we have a couple of returns for one, depending on different spellings, but 773 images just for that spelling of his name. And that's just for one person. That is just for Medgar Evers. You get to this next spelling, there's another 70, on and on. And like, these are just some of the notes you see. They're fully zoomable. They're high def so that you can really get in there and read the notes. And that's there for anybody that wants to use that resource. If you just go to our webpage and the digital archives, you'll see the Sovereignty Commission featured right there and can click it.
That's really a wonderful resource for folks. We don't seem to have any other questions posted. Okay. Do you have any other final comments before I wrap us up?
So I think one of the biggest things that I took when researching this and when I've done presentations of this type in the past is just really, if you're looking into the civil rights movement and connections to World War II, there's obviously a lot of big names that are involved, but look for some of those unsung heroes in your community or in your state that don't necessarily get the attention that they deserve. If there were people in your state doing that. And depending on where you're located, there's a reasonable chance that you're a great migration city from people from the South, but you may still have some connections to some of these southern states as well through family that you could research from that regard too. Because there's a chance that, somebody that you didn't realize may have done some pretty impactful work, both either in World War II or the civil rights movement or both. So that would be my charge for any budding future historians out there.
Great. Well, on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and our guest speaker, Al Wheat from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. And we hope that you enjoyed today's program and will subscribe to our YouTube channel and provide feedback.